Obesity has become an epidemic. So we are all nowadays faced with more and more of these patients coming up for surgery, be it bariatric or non-bariatric surgeries. Those days, anesthesiologists used to say, pediatrics, oh, he is just like a miniature adult. So what's the big deal? Similarly, morbidly obese, so he's an overgrown adult. What's the big deal? But as we all know, there is a world of difference in handling a normal patient, a pediatric patient, or a morbidly obese patient. So, how are these patients different from normal patients? That is what we will discuss here. These patients are challenged by virtue of their size, their comorbidities, and the complexity of the surgical procedure. The main difference between a normal person and a morbidly obese is by a sheer increase in size, there is an increase in the oxygen demand. So, an increase in the oxygen consumption naturally leads to an increase in the carbon dioxide production. So, the whole pathophysiology in morbidly obese patients is catering to these two needs. So, there is an complete alteration in the respiratory, the cardiovascular system, and all other systems just to meet these needs. In fact, there is a very tight balance between oxygen supply and demand in these patients. Now, even a slight exercise or walking can lead to an increase in the oxygen demand, but at the same time, the supply is so much reduced, the FRC is so much reduced, more so in supine position or during induction of anesthesia or during pneumoperitoneum in laparoscopic surgeries, there is a further reduction in FRC. And as we all know, FRC is the oxygen reserve. So when the reserve is less and the demand is more, automatically the balance tilts and there is a hypoxemia. If we actually see the studies, they say that every excess weight kilo requires 6 ml of oxygen per minute per kilo of the excess weight. So for example, a 50 kilo patient automatically needs 300 ml of oxygen per minute, more than a normal person. So as such, his demands are so high. Now, similarly is the cardiovascular system also. So each kilo of excess fat requires 30 ml of blood. That means a 50 kilo patient automatically has a 1.5 liter excessive blood volume. Therefore, the cardiac output is increased. But if you actually see the tissue blood flow, that is decreased to only 45 ml per kilogram body weight. So more is the cardiac output, more is the load on the heart. So there is initially a left ventricular hypertrophy, slowly leading to a left ventricular failure. Now, similarly, in these patients, they have a dreaded comorbidity called obstructive sleep apnea. A chronic hypoxemia automatically leads to pulmonary arterial hypertension, which leads to right ventricular hypertrophy initially, and then a right ventricular failure. Now, they have other comorbidities like hypertension, ischemic heart disease, all kinds of arrhythmias. So just like we hear hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, dilated cardiomyopathy, there's a separate new entity which is called as obesity cardiomyopathy. So, as I said, these patients have multiple comorbidities, diabetes, dyslipidemia, psychiatric disorders, cardiac disorders, liver disease, etc. Now, these patients, one basic thing we must remember is because of the right ventricular enlargement hypertrophy, they can go into a right ventricular failure. Similarly, because of the left ventricular hypertrophy, the hypertension, ischemic heart disease, they have a left ventricular failure. So these patients actually have a biventricular failure. So this is a condition which is extremely difficult to treat. Now, one dreaded complication in these patients is pulmonary embolism. In fact, it is one of the leading causes of death in morbidly obese patients in the postoperative period. They have venous stasis disease. Obesity as such are hypercoagulable states. There is edema feet, a sedentary lifestyle, polycythemia because of hypoxemia. So all this automatically leads to a increased incidence of deep vein thrombosis. And there are no clear-cut dosing guidelines as far as anticoagulants are concerned, whether it is according to the ideal body weight, lean body weight. So there is again no consensus here. Now, there is a prophylactic, something called prophylactic IVC filter. Some of these morbidly obese patients who have a high incidence of DVT and a high likelihood of pulmonary embolism in the post-operative period, we even insert a prophylactic IVC filter before they come up for an elective procedure. So once the surgery is done, at a later date, this IVC filter is removed. So even one must be aware that such a thing also exists. Now, gastroesophageal reflux disease and hiatus hernia, there is an increased incidence in these patients, and this automatically leads to an increase in the aspiration of gastric contents, which we must remember. Now, in the last decade, a new terminology called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or NASH, has been introduced. This is nothing but fat infiltration in the liver. Interestingly, a lot of fat infiltration in the liver, NASH, can ultimately lead to liver failure or cirrhosis liver. We have even had patients coming up for transplant, liver transplant following a NASH cirrhosis. Therefore, when we do PAC of these patients, in view of the multiple comorbidities, it is going to be a time-consuming thing. Now, a patient who sometimes needs a walker or sometimes needs a wheelchair or even a stretcher to come into the PAC room. So the mere entry into the PAC room itself may take some time. And our main idea here is to establish a very good rapport with the patient and decreases anxiety levels. A very careful history and examination is extremely vital. History of herbal supplements and appetite suppressants must be noted down as they interfere in the anesthesia charts. Now, the various comorbidities like obstructive sleep apnea, the hypertension, ischemic heart disease, etc. should be asked. There are various criteria to diagnose obstructive sleep apnea, which I am not going into detail here. But remember, there is something called a stop bank criteria, which we'll subsequently discuss in the next chapter. This should be already incorporated in the PAC chart itself, so that we never miss asking any of these leading questions. So once the comorbidities are diagnosed, now optimization of comorbidities becomes extremely important before surgery. So an interdisciplinary approach where a pulmonologist, an endocrinologist, cardiologist and all, even a psychiatrist may be required in the preoperative period. When it comes to risk assessment, according to the ASA, any patient with BMI between 35 and 40 automatically fall into ASA risk 3, and BMI more than 40 goes into ASA risk 4. And last decade we saw a scoring called obesity surgery mortality risk 4, wherein they evaluated 5 points: age, gender, hypertension, risk of thromboembolism and BMI. Each of these was given 1 point, and they said if the risk is more than 3, the mortality becomes 2.4%. Therefore, this definitely with the learning curve, I'm sure this scoring requires to be revisited. When you put a stethoscope on a normal patient, you automatically hear the heart sounds, the lung sounds very clearly. But here, you put the steth on the morbidly obese patient. Because of the thick chest wall, the heart sounds are so muffled. Now, when you come to the measurement of blood pressure, you require a bigger sized cuff for them. ECG invariably shows a low voltage. Echocardiograph, always they report a poor window and therefore echo could not be done. Similarly is the stress echo. Some of them may require a thallium scan, but fitting into the gantry is a big issue. Now, some patients have even needed a transesophageal echocardiography for assessment of their cardiac status. Now, breath holding time must be checked and noted down in the PAC charts. Look for venous cannulation sites. Examination of calf muscles for varicose veins is again a must. Airway examination, again, it's one of the most important examination as far as any patient is concerned. But in these patients, because of the increased neck circumference due to the pharyngeal fat, the measurement of the neck circumference becomes an important criteria. So we must have an inch tape in the PAC room itself. So once we measure the neck circumference, it must be noted down in the PAC chart. Neck extension again should be noted down. We have found patients with a large neck circumference with limited neck mobility. These form a very difficult, these are candidates of very difficult airway. Okay, once we have done the PAC, some preoperative special preparation in these patients includes deep breathing exercises to reduce the atelectasis and keep it to as minimum as possible. In-center spirometry is a very good goal-directed therapy in these patients. Patients who have been diagnosed with obstructive sleep apnea, need for BiPAP or CPAP titration in the preoperative period, and having a best ABG when they come for surgery. DVT prophylaxis is a must. A good counseling and to reduce the anxiety levels in these patients is extremely important. Now, when it comes to pre-medication, in moderate to severe obstructive sleep apneic patients, it is better to avoid the sedative pre-medication. In fact, cases have been reported where just with pre-medication, they've gone into respiratory failure in the ward itself. Therefore, it is mandatory that we are aware of this. Regurgitation prophylaxis, DVT prophylaxis again is mandatory. The other things like continuing antihypertensives, thyroid, etc. is as in any other patient. Some patients even require nebulization in the preoperative period just before induction of anesthesia. Now, there are extra facilities required which the institution should cater to, be it in the OPD, the wards, the operation theatre, radiology or emergency, wherever there are high likelihood of these patients visiting. So the bed should be a weight-bearing bed with a good remote control where we can adjust head up and head down. The chairs or the sofas should have a wider seating to make them comfortable. In fact, even the wheelchairs should be having a wider seating capacity. Even the washroom should have toilets which are nicely cement mounted on the floor. There are various shifting equipments like path slide or other equipments which must be available. The ambulance facilities also should have this stretcher which will be the weight bearing stretchers. Preparation of OT again is vital before taking up these patients to the for surgery. A equipment checklist should be checked. A difficult airway cart is mandatory. All the infusion pumps should be checked and kept ready. The monitoring devices, the shifting equipment, ultrasound machine, again one of the most important armamentarium when we do morbidly obese patients. Now, even simple having additional sheets, silicone gel pads, rings, and strapping equipment, sequential compression device, all these are basic requirements before we take up this patient. The OT table, of course, should have a remote control. We should check the functioning of the remote, whether we can do a head up, head down position, etc. One of the daunting tasks is to locate veins in these patients. We have even used sometimes veins on the chest wall for induction of anesthesia. Some anesthesiologists are comfortable with infrared rays to locate the superficial veins. Ultrasound has come up in a big way in locating veins for us, be it the peripheral veins or be it the central veins. Remember, even the central veins like IJV or external jugular, it is all, anatomy is so obscured because of the pharyngeal fat. But with ultrasound, life has become much simpler for us. Regional anesthesia, yes, is challenging. But as we all know that there are totally obscured landmarks, the positioning of the patient is extremely difficult. The depth perception is difficult. The needle sometimes required may be longer in size. The volume of the anesthetic drugs required may be altered. So regional anesthesia itself is again very challenging. When it comes to general anesthesia, we must remember that they all must be placed in the ramp position. And once we place them in the ramp position, pre-oxygenation with PEEP is mandatory, and the endpoint of a good pre-oxygenation is reduction in ETC, having an ETO2 value of more than 90%. Now, this automatically increases the safe apnea period which we have for tracheal intubation. Yes, they are difficult airways. What we have found is they are extremely difficult mask ventilations. Sometimes 2 or even 3 anesthesiologists may be required when it comes to proper mask ventilation in these patients. Thankfully, the second generation supraglottic airway device has been used instead of a mask. This provides a nice bridging before securing the airway, doing the tracheal intubation. Now with this, we can automatically provide a good good ventilation with PEEP, and our anesthesiast's hands are not fatigued, more hands are not required. Earlier there was a myth that supraglottic devices are a strict no in morbidly obese patients. Thankfully, that is not there now. Now, when it comes to ventilatory strategies, whether pressure control should be given, volume control should be given, what should be the tidal volume? Is it according to the ideal body weight, the total body weight, lean body weight? How much should be the respiratory rate in these patients? What is the IE ratio? Is it standard 1:2, or is it 1:1.5, or what is it? What is the peak airway pressure, plateau pressure? How much PEEP are we giving? All this has to be monitored, and this we will discuss in the subsequent lectures. Now in the ABG, when we do, our alveolar arterial gradient again is a very important parameter in adjusting the ventilatory parameters. Pharmacology of drugs, it is more of an art to give drugs to these patients than is the science. Some drugs according to ideal body weight, some according to lean body weight, some according to the total body weight. And if you give less drugs, awareness is a dreaded complication. If you give more drugs, they are so sensitive that there is difficulty in the recovery. Now opioids, etc., the sensitivity is very high. So it is very difficult to titrate the drugs. So as I said, it is more of an art of giving drugs than is the scientific way of giving drugs. Intraoperative, some special issues in these patients are, we must do proper padding of the pressure points. Now, improper padding of pressure points, especially in a patient who is going to undergo a prolonged surgery, has led to ischemic necrosis of the tissue, leading to a dreaded complication called rhabdomyolysis, which can even lead to an acute renal failure. And there have been patients who have required dialysis in the postoperative period. Now, the next thing is proper strapping of the patient is again mandatory. Hypothermia should be avoided at every cost, and positioning of these patients should be done very cautiously. Before handing over the patient, it is a good thing to have another check before whether the pressure points are padded properly, the positioning is okay, strapping is okay, etc. So that intraoperatively we have minimum risks. Fluid titration. Is it goal-directed fluid therapy or more fluid therapy? Some say 40 ml per kilogram body weight. Some say 15 ml per kilogram body weight is enough. Again, there is a lot of variation. There is no consensus again. Now, laparoscopic surgery, especially if you are doing, urine output again is not a proper indicative of the good fluid titration. CVP again is not reliable. Sometimes stroke volume variation may be required to monitor the fluids in these patients. Again, a gray zone actually. When it comes to monitoring, I must stress that even if you're giving just sedation to the patient, or if the patient is in the post-operative period, EtCO2 monitor is the most mandatory monitor in these patients. Anytime the EtCO2 goes high, we must carefully go and manage the patients. Now, when especially sedation during endoscopy, etc., Nowadays, portable ETCO2 monitors are available, which tell you the IPI index, etc. So it is a very useful monitor and a mandatory monitor as far as endoscopy, etc. is concerned. Now, ECG, the other routine monitors, this monitor plays an important role in titration of the drugs. Now, a MAC should be noted down. Invasive arterial BP only in those patients where we require frequent monitoring of arterial blood gas analysis, or the BP cuff does not fit properly in these. Now, when it comes to tracheal extubation, again, it's a very tricky situation, because the moment surgery is over, everybody wants to have a relaxing time. The senior technicians, the senior surgeons, everybody is out of the OT. And this is the crucial time when the anesthesiologist again needs help. Now, as the dictum is, if you are doubtful about the tracheal extubation, let the tube be in. Delay the extubation. Use maneuvers like Bailey's maneuver, the Cook's airway exchange catheters, etc., which again we will be discussing in subsequent lectures. Now, one thing is very clear. We must do a good, proper alveolar recruitment before the tracheal extubation, and once the patient is awake, supplemental oxygen during transport from the OT to the recovery room, and again always in the head up position. Shifting also in the head up position. In the recovery room, the DVT prophylaxis will continue, multimodal analgesia will be continuing. The patient must be encouraged to start incentive spirometry as early as possible. Now, fast tracking is another concept which is now very useful technique in morbidly obese patients. These patients are encouraged to ambulate as early as possible. And we all know an ambulating patient means there is decreased incidence of hypoxemia, decreased incidence of pain, the diaphragmatic splinting is not there, there's decreased incidence of deep vein thrombosis. So all the complications are avoided. The anesthesiologist, surgeon, patient, relatives, everybody is happy to see a patient walking immediately after a major surgery. Now, when it comes to shifting, you require so many extra personnel to help in shifting of these patients from the OT table to the trolley or the bed. Early complications like hypoxemia, deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, etc. must be noted down. One must be aware, and any tachycardia, any hypertension, hypotension, increased sweating, mismatched pain relief, decreased urinary output, all this must be carefully noted, and also the ETCO2 and the IPI index. So any alteration in this, the recovery room staff must be trained, and she must inform the anesthesiologist as early as possible to catch these complications and rectify them as early as possible. So what is different then? Everything was different. The pathophysiology is altered, the pre-op assessment is different, the perioperative management is different, the logistics of the institution again to cater to these patients is different, the sensitivity of the nursing paramedical staff, which is of utmost importance. Now some extra equipments are required for us, for the surgeons. So bariatric surgery is already a super specialty. Bariatric anesthesiologists have become an integral part of the bariatric team. So the future, definitely we require a wider database, good RCTs, continuing education, sensitivity training to all the staff handling these patients. Each institution must form their own protocols, their own guidelines. The clinical pathways must be very crystal clear and should be revisited again and again. Nowadays, there are many youngsters who want to do fellowship course in bariatric anesthesia. So it is very clear that it is a newer emerging super specialty. So bariatric anesthesia definitely helps in the safety of these patients. Thank you so much.